Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl, a.k.a. Artsy Island Girl for Pajama Crafter Stamps. We're celebrating Teacher Week this week, and for me, this is a job that you need to be a warrior for. So for my Teacher Week card, I'm using the Unstoppable stamp set, the You Are stamp set, as well as the In Our Hearts Always stamp set. I love this little girl here with the armor on. I also love the words in the outer ring of that You Are stamp set. And I'm going to be using the In Our Hearts Always stamp set just to add a little bit of pattern and texture to my background. I'm in the mood to do some watercoloring today, so I'm going to heat emboss my images on watercolor cardstock before I use any of my clear stamps. I use a white eraser on the stamping surface just to rub any possible manufacturing residue off of that surface and help it take ink just a little bit better. I'm going to position my stamp, and I'm going to only ink that outer rim of the stamp because for this card, I only want the words from that outer ring. So if by chance I get any ink on the inner ring, I can just rub or brush any embossing powder that happens to stick to that off. So I'm just using my embossing ink, just going around the outside edge, and I'm going to stamp that. And then I'm going to use some black embossing powder for this background. I want to make sure that those words are very, very visible. And I'm creating a background that has lots of bright color. So I don't want to get those words mixed in the color. I don't want them to be subtle. I want them to be nice and bright. So black embossing powder is perfect for that. I'm using super fine embossing powder because of the tiny words. It's going to give the most detail to it. Now you can see at the bottom towards the right there, I'm missing a little bit of those words, but my figure is going to go in front of that. So I'm not too worried about that because that's going to be hidden. I'm using my embossing tool to melt that powder in place. Now, watercolor cardstock has one side that's more textured and the other side that's more smooth. Anytime I'm using watercolor with stamping and embossing, I always use the more smooth side because I want to get as much detail from those stamps as possible. And I don't want that texture from the cardstock to get in place or get in the way. For the In Your Heart Always stamps, I'm just putting them on an acrylic block so I can just put some of that texture around the outside of my background. I thought if I left it off, it was going to be a little bit too plain. And I want my texture to be a little bit different than the embossed words on the background. So for these, I'm embossing them with white embossing powder. Typically, if I'm doing a project, I will just choose one color of embossing powder and use that all the way through. For this particular card, I'm using 3 different colors. When it comes to my Unstoppable Warrior Girl, I'm going to emboss her in silver embossing powder because I think it suits the armor best. So just like my first stamp set, I'm using a white eraser on the stamping surface because I haven't used this one before. This step is something that only needs to be done one time. So I only do it the very first time I'm using a set, and I do the entire set because it takes only a few seconds to do the entire set. Once I've done the set or once I've used a stamp from the set, I know it's done. I don't ever have to do that again. So I put my watercolor paper in my stamping tool and then I stamp that image, and I typically like to stamp it a couple times to make sure that I get all the detail to it. I also like to use some embossing powder tool on that cardstock so that when I pour my embossing powder on there, it's only going to stick to my stamped image and not to any possible oils that I've left there from my fingers. If there's any embossing powder anywhere that I don't want it to be, I'm just going to use a soft brush to move that or remove it before I heat emboss it. So I am going to be fussy cutting this girl once she's done being watercolored. So I have her on a separate piece of cardstock. If you have a scrap piece of watercolor cardstock, that would work as well. We don't necessarily need the whole thing, but I want to fussy cut her and I want to have her raised on that surface. I'm using ink refills for ink pads. So these are dye refills. They are water soluble. They're perfect for watercoloring. They're one of my favorite things for watercoloring because you can get a really, really pale color of each one, or you can get a lot of pigment in them. You can use whatever you like for watercoloring. You can also take your dye ink pads and you can smush them on your surface or on a non-porous surface on an acrylic block or a plate, and you can use that for ink as well. Another option would be to use dye markers. You can scribble those onto a non-porous surface and use that as an ink palette as well. So there's a lot of different options for watercoloring. I chose a skin color for her skin. I want her hair to be nice and bold, so I'm using a brown for her hair, making sure that the surface that is higher that would receive more light is lighter than the part that is darker that would be in shadow or would have some shading to it. Now I am using a water brush here that has water right in the handle. So you can see I have a piece of paper towel to my right. Anytime I change colors, I squeeze my brush onto that paper towel to remove any color from my bristles. I can also take excess water or excess color out of my brush with the same thing. I find this really, really handy. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, so I don't want to chance having a jar of water on my desk because I would likely tip it over. So this is the best thing for me, and all it takes is a piece of paper towel to the side, and I can easily change the colors quite quickly. Now for her armor, I want it to be silver. So I'm using a silver pad that is water soluble. This works perfectly for watercoloring. If you don't happen to have a silver ink pad that's water soluble, metallic watercolors obviously will work here as well. Now when I'm watercoloring these, I'm trying to make some areas lighter and some areas darker, but it tended to work out that it looks pretty monotone other than the raised embossing surface. So what I end up doing is once I have my entire armor watercolor, I use a dark gray color from the dye refills and I color in that dimension and that detail, and you can see how much detail you get. It makes the image come to life and it just gives you so much more of the detail that's in there. Right now it just looks fairly flat. You don't really see a lot of that, but you'll see as soon as I start adding the dark gray color, it will totally bring those areas out. We'll see a lot more of those details and it won't look quite so flat. Now the cool thing is because this silver is water soluble and this gray is water soluble, it is going to blend the silver and the gray together, so it's going to end up looking like we have two different silver tones to it. So we will still get that metallic. The gray is not going to take any of that silver metallic away. We're just going to be able to see a lot more detail, a lot more dimension, and it's just going to bring that character to life. She'll be a lot less flat than with just that silver metallic pad. Now I chose to emboss my images here. I tend to prefer embossing my images when I watercolor. First of all, I like the extra dimension and the different texture we get from embossing because it gives the lines to the stamped image a raised surface. So it just adds natural texture to those images. It also makes it really easy for watercoloring because of that raised edge. Your watercolor tends to stay within the lines, and it makes it a lot easier for doing that watercoloring. You don't have to worry about two different colors blending in together beside each other. For my background, I just want a really nice, bright, bold background. So I'm starting with a bright blue in the center. I misted my watercolor cardstock on the back as well as my surface to press it down. When you're watercoloring, if you only have water on one side of the paper, it tends to start buckling and bowing. If you put watercolor or water on both sides of the paper, it keeps it a little bit flat. And by suctioning it to my table, it makes the watercolor stay where I put it. It makes those areas a lot flatter so that I can control it a little bit better. If I were to only have water on one side and watercolor on one side, areas that are really heavy or have a lot of moisture to them would start to run to the side. So I like having the control over it. However, it does make it take longer to dry because the air is only getting to it from the surface or from the upper surface. So what I do is once my watercolor has absorbed any of the moisture, once there's no pools of water on it, I will lift it up and put some paper towel underneath it so that the air can get to it to help it to dry a little bit better. Now you can see that I'm being really messy with my watercolor here. I'm just trying to get that bold color behind there. And then once I'm done, I'm going to mist it with water. Those colors will blend together a little bit more and it'll be a little bit less messy. Now, one of the reasons why I chose the warrior for my teacher card is because this is a job that I don't believe I could do. I've taught adult classes, card classes before. I've taught the odd children's or kids card classes, and let me tell you, those kids ones are way more difficult in my opinion. Being a school teacher, I think you need to be a warrior to do it. You need to be a special type of person to be able to do that, and it's definitely not something that I have the energy, the patience, or in my opinion, the ability to do. So I definitely find that you have to be someone that is strong, someone that is super patient. So to me, this warrior totally suited that, or suits that job, suits what I think you need to be a teacher and to be able to handle all of that and everything that comes with it. That is why I chose this, but you could easily change this theme to something else if that suited you better. I just think this is, for me, what I picture teachers as. This is totally suitable. So once I have gotten the main amount of color down there, I took my mister and I misted water over top. I added a little bit more green to the leaves. I wanted them to pop out just a little bit more, but I really love the bold background and I love the two different embossed outlines between the words in the circle and the leaves. I think it's really, really effective. and just has a really unique look to it. While waiting for my background to dry, I'm using my detail scissors to fussy cut around my warrior. I'm going on the right outside the edges of that embossing. I don't want to leave a halo. However, you certainly could leave a white halo if you wanted to add that. I want to see her right in front of that bright background, so I don't think it really needs it. Now, there are a few strands of hair. I don't bother cutting around them. I just cut them right off, but you certainly could. If you like to cut around little bits of hair, you absolutely could if you want. Another option would be to wait until the background is completely dry, emboss her onto the background so that when you glue her on top of there, the hairs would be on that background and you wouldn't lose that detail. Now, I always love finding different ways of adding extra texture to my watercolors. One of the ways I like to do that is with glossy accents. It just adds a shiny domed dimension. So I'm putting some glossy accents on some different areas of the armor as well as her eyes and then the heart in the middle of that shield. Now, I want glossy accents to be on the entire shield. However, because these are watercolors and these are water soluble, if I were to put the glossy accents over the entire shield, the silver and that pink would totally run together and it would end up being messy. So I'm only putting it on the heart right now. Once that is completely dry, I'm going to put my card together and then I'll put some glossy accents over the entire shield. So we'll have that entire thing covered, but we will protect that heart and the color underneath there. To add a little bit of texture to my background, I'm adding some glitter glue to the leaves. Now, this is a transparent opalescent glitter glue. We're still going to see that color. It's only going to add that texture as well as that bit of sparkle, and it just gives watercolor a little bit more interest in the background. So I let that dry overnight because our background was still kind of wet. I put the stickles on there while it was still wet, figuring we might as well let that watercolor dry and that stickles dry at the same time. I've done it before. It works totally fine, especially if we're just putting it over one area. Again, with the stickles, we don't want to put it over several colors because those colors will blend together. I only wanted a little bit of texture on the leaves. Now that our background has dried overnight, it's completely dry. I want to take that Unstoppable stamp and I'm going to stamp it on the bottom of my background with black embossing powder. I want that to be nice and bold as well. You could also use silver if you wanted to tie that Unstoppable sentiment with the warrior. That would work as well, but we want to make sure that it's actually visible over our bright background. So I stamped it a couple times. I also put some embossing powder tool on there because I wanted to make sure that that embossing powder was only going to stick to the words. Then I heat embossed it. Now, we could have put the word there before, but I wanted to make sure that there was going to be space with my warrior, and I couldn't really tell until it was fussy cut. I also wasn't sure if I wanted to put it as a separate piece on top, but I didn't want to cover that beautiful bright background. I wanted to see all those colors, so I chose to put it right on the background. I have my main background there cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I took a piece of black cardstock and I trimmed it to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. So we have a nice black border around our background here. We're not going to see a lot of our A2 card base or our border, but it is going to frame it really nicely and it's going to tie in that black embossing as well as our sentiment. To give the card a little bit more dimension, I'm using some foam pop dots on our fussy cut warrior. If there are some of those pop dots that are a little bit too big, I can cut them in half, like for the feet, to make sure that those are still popped up. I am putting quite a few of them on the back there. I want to make sure that most of those areas are nice and supported. I'll put her on my card and then I'll slice a little bit off of a pop dot and put it behind the sword as well, so that is glued down there as well. So once I have these over the back, and these are ones that don't have a ton of dimension to them. I think it's probably about 1/8 of an inch thickness, so they're not super thick. I put it onto my card and it's just going to make her pop out a little bit from that background and give it just a little bit more interest, a little bit more dimension. So I took a little sliver from another pop dot, put it on the back of that sword, took the backing off and we glued it down there. And now I'm going to add the glossy accents to the rest of the shield to make sure that that entire thing has some glossy domed dimension to it. But like I said before, it's going to make it so that we don't have that pink color blending in. So here is my warrior card for Teacher Week. To me, it totally suits teachers. I think they are definitely warriors. And like I said, it's a job that I totally admire and I know that I couldn't do myself. You'll find everything that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. And if you're looking for more inspiration for Teacher Week, definitely check out the Pajama Crafter Stamps Facebook page. You'll find more inspiration shared over there throughout the week. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a fantastic day.